The morning air in the Galactic University buzzed with excitement as hundreds of alien students filed into the massive amphitheater. The smell of methane from the gas-breathing species mixed with the ozone scent of the energy beings, creating a cocktail of alien presence that would have overwhelmed most newcomers. But Alex Turner had been here for 3 months now, and he barely noticed anymore. Alex slipped into his usual seat in the back row, a worn metal chair that creaked under his weight. Around him, his classmates chatted in dozens of languages, their voices creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and harmonic vibrations that the universal translators worked overtime to convert into understandable speech. To his left sat Krill, a massive Gromax warrior whose species was known throughout the galaxy for their military prowess. His thick, armored hide bore the ritual scars of a dozen campaigns, and his forearms constantly moved in what Alex had learned were nervous habits from his combat training. Despite his fearsome appearance, Krill had been nothing but friendly to the human, though he always seemed puzzled by Alex's calm demeanor. On Alex's right, a cluster of Etherians floated in their containment suits, their gaseous forms shifting between blue and purple as they discussed the upcoming lecture. These beings had evolved from star plasma and could manipulate electromagnetic fields with their thoughts. Yet they treated Alex with the same casual politeness they showed everyone else. The amphitheater itself was a marvel of engineering, carved from a single piece of crystallized space-time that reflected light in impossible ways. The seats descended in concentric circles toward a central stage where a massive holographic projector waited. Students from 47 different species filled the space, each adapted to their homeworld's unique environment, yet all united in their pursuit of knowledge. Professor Kilthara entered from the side passage, his tall, mantis-like form moving with the fluid grace of his species. The Velkari were known as the galaxy's premier scholars, their 4 eyes capable of processing information at speeds that put most computers to shame. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the amphitheater's lights, and the ceremonial robes of his academic rank rustled as he moved. "Students," the professor began, his voice carrying easily through the vast space, "today we embark on a journey into the darkest corners of our galaxy. We will examine the creatures that have shaped the nightmares of civilized species for millennia." A ripple of excitement passed through the crowd. This was the lecture they had all been waiting for since the semester began. The study of Deathworld predators was considered one of the most dangerous and fascinating subjects in XENOBIO-OGY. Alex pulled out his datapad, the same standard issue device every student carried. His fingers moved across the surface, taking notes in the simple script of his native language. Several nearby students had glanced at his writing over the past months, commenting on how primitive it looked compared to their own flowing scripts or mathematical notation systems. "The galaxy," Professor Kalthara continued, "is home to wonders beyond imagination. But it is also home to horrors that defy comprehension. Today, we will catalog the apex predators that have earned their place in the galactic bestiary through blood and terror." The lights dimmed, and the holographic projector hummed to life. The first image that appeared was a star chart, showing the known galaxy with certain systems marked in ominous red. These were the Deathworlds, planets where evolution had taken a particularly violent turn. "Class 15 Deathworlds," the professor explained, "represent the upper limit of what we consider survivable. These planets have produced creatures so dangerous that even our most advanced military forces approach them with extreme caution." Alex noticed how several students unconsciously leaned back in their seats as the professor spoke. The Pixarians, tiny humanoid creatures from a peaceful garden world, actually huddled together for comfort. Even the normally stoic Centaurians, whose species had conquered dozens of star systems, seemed nervous. "But surely," called out a brave Altarian from the middle section, "with our technology, these creatures pose no real threat to modern civilization." "Professor." Kilthara's mandibles clicked in what Alex had learned was the Valkyrie equivalent of a grim smile. "Technology, young Zix, is only as effective as the being wielding it. Many of these creatures have evolved beyond our ability to fully comprehend." let alone defeat. The professor gestured, and the holographic display shifted to show a twisted landscape of crystalline formations and energy storms. Consider the world of Zarian Prime, where the very rocks pulse with malevolent life. The creatures there have evolved to feed on the energy signatures of technological devices. As the lecture continued, Alex found himself studying his classmates as much as the material. These beings represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization, yet they reacted to images of alien predators with the same primal fear that had once driven his own ancestors to huddle around fires in the darkness. That the irony wasn't lost on him. Here he sat, surrounded by species that could manipulate matter with their thoughts, travel between dimensions, and communicate across vast distances through quantum entanglement. Yet they spoke of Earth's creatures as if they were harmless pets. The fascinating aspect of predator evolution, Professor Kilthara was saying, is how it shapes not just the hunter, but the entire ecosystem. A true apex predator doesn't just kill, it fundamentally alters the behavior of every other species in its environment. Alex thought of the African savanna, where the mere scent of a lion could change the grazing patterns of herbivores for miles around. He thought of the deep ocean, where ancient predators had driven the evolution of speed, camouflage, and intelligence in countless species. Tomorrow, the professor announced, we will begin our detailed examination of specific creatures. I warn you now, some of what you will see may disturb you. The universe is not a kind place, and evolution is not a gentle process. As the class filed out, Alex heard fragments of conversation in dozens of languages. The students were excited but nervous, already planning study groups and support sessions to help them through the difficult material ahead. Krill fell into step beside him as they climbed the stairs toward the exit. You seem remarkably calm about all this, the Gromax warrior observed. Are you not concerned about learning of such dangerous creatures? Alex considered the question as they emerged into the university's main corridor. Through the transparent walls he could see the city stretching away toward the horizon, its spires reaching toward the alien sky. I suppose I'm curious more than anything else, he said finally. Curious? Krill's voice carried a note of disbelief. About creatures that could tear apart a battle cruiser? Everything's dangerous if you don't understand it, Alex replied. Understanding usually makes things less frightening? The Gromax pondered this as they walked. Your species has an interesting philosophy, very different from ours. Alex smiled but said nothing. Tomorrow's lecture would be interesting indeed. The second day of lectures brought a heavier atmosphere to the amphitheater. Word had spread through the student body about the disturbing nature of the material they would be covering, and Alex noticed that several seats remained empty. Those who had come sat closer together, as if seeking comfort in numbers. Alex took his usual position in the back row, his datapad ready. The morning light streaming through the crystalline dome cast strange shadows across the assembled students, adding to the ominous mood that had settled over the hall. Professor Kelthara entered carrying a sealed data cylinder, the kind used for storing classified military information. His 4 eyes scanned the reduced crowd with what might have been approval. Before we begin, the professor announced, I must remind you that the information we will discuss today is restricted under Galactic Security Protocol 7. What you learn here is not to be shared with unauthorized personnel. Several students shifted uncomfortably. Protocol 7 was reserved for information that could cause panic if released to the general population. Our first subject, the professor continued, activating the holographic display, is the Void Stalker of the Kepler 7 system. The creature that materialized above the amphitheater was unlike anything from conventional nightmares. It stood 12 feet tall, its body a constantly shifting mass of what appeared to be living shadow. Where its face should have been, reality seemed to bend and twist, creating an optical illusion that hurt to look at directly. The Void Stalker exists partially outside our dimensional framework, Professor Kilthara explained as several students averted their eyes from the projection. It feeds on the life force of sentient beings, but not in any way we understand. Victims are found completely intact, yet somehow empty of everything that made them alive. A Pixarian in the front row raised a trembling hand. How do we know so much about it if it's so dangerous? Automated probe data, the professor replied grimly. 3 separate expeditions have attempted to study these creatures directly. None returned. The hologram shifted to show grainy footage from a military surveillance drone. The camera tracked across a desolate landscape of twisted metal and crystalline formations. Suddenly, the image flickered, and when it stabilized, the Void Stalker was standing directly in front of the camera, its non-face turned toward the lens. Half the class immediately looked away. Several students made choking sounds, and one of the Etherians flickered so violently that his containment suit's alarms activated. Alex leaned forward slightly, studying the creature with the same interest he might show a particularly complex mathematical equation. The Void Stalker's movement patterns suggested it was hunting by following some kind of energy signature. Its behavior reminded him of a big cat stalking prey if the cat existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The creature's hunting methods are particularly disturbing, Professor Kilthara continued. It appears to toy with its prey, allowing them to believe they have escaped before appearing again. This psychological torment seems to be as important to the creature as the eventual feeding. The display changed to show a series of abandoned settlements, each one bearing the same signs of sudden evacuation. Personal belongings scattered as if their owners had simply vanished mid-action. Next, we examined the plasma forms of Rigel 4. The professor announced. The new hologram showed creatures that looked like enormous earthworms, but their segmented bodies glowed with internal fire. Each segment was the size of a transport shuttle, and the complete creatures stretched for miles across the planet's surface. These beings are essentially living fusion reactors, Professor Kelthar explained. They consume heavy metals and convert them directly into plasma energy. A single worm can generate enough heat to melt through a starship's hull in seconds. The video footage showed a mining operation on Rigel 4, the massive excavation equipment. Looked like toys compared to the creature that suddenly erupted from the ground. The plasma worm's body blazed with light as it consumed the mining machinery, metal flowing like water in the intense heat. The worms travel through the planets. Crust like fish through water, the professor continued. They're attracted to large metal concentrations, which makes any technological presence on their world extremely dangerous. Krill leaned over to whisper to Alex. How does your species deal with creatures like these? We don't have anything quite like that, Alex whispered back. But we have ways of dealing with dangerous animals. The Gromax warrior looked skeptical. What could your primitive weapons do against something that melts starships? Alex thought of the asteroid that had ended the age of dinosaurs and the humans who had learned to split atoms. We're creative when we need to be. The lecture continued with a parade of horrors. The gravity manipulators of the Andromeda spiral, slug-like beings that could crush prey by creating localized gravitational fields. The hive minds of the outer rim, insect swarms whose collective consciousness could overwhelm individual thought and turn victims into extensions of the hive. Each creature was more terrifying than the last, and Alex watched his classmates' reactions with growing interest. These were beings from advanced civilizations, species that had mastered faster-than-light travel and energy manipulation, yet they huddled together like frightened children as the professor described each new horror. The key to understanding these creatures, Professor Kelthara was saying, is recognizing that they have evolved beyond our normal parameters of biology. They don't simply hunt for food or territory, they hunt because it is their fundamental nature. The display shifted to show a star chart with multiple systems marked in red. Each of these worlds has produced its own unique apex predator. The galaxy is vast, and evolution has had billions of years to perfect the art of killing. Alex made a note on his datapad, writing in the simple script that his classmates found so primitive. He was beginning to understand something that none of his fellow students seemed to grasp. These creatures were certainly dangerous, but they were also specialized. Each one had evolved to dominate a specific environment under specific conditions. The most disturbing aspect, the professor continued, is how these creatures seem to actively seek out contact with intelligent species. They don't simply defend their territory, they hunt us. A student from the middle section raised a tentacle. Is there any common weakness among these creatures? Some way to defend against them? Professor Kilthara's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. The unfortunate truth is that each species requires different defensive strategies. What works against a void stalker would be useless against a plasma worm. The galaxy's apex predators are as diverse as they are deadly. The professor gestured, and the holographic display showed a massive creature that seemed to be made of crystallized spacetime itself. This brings us to perhaps the most feared predator in known space, the Shadow Maw of the Veil Nebula. The new image caused an immediate reaction. Several students actually fled the amphitheater, their various forms of locomotion creating a chaotic exodus. Those who remained seemed frozen in place, staring at the impossible geometry of the creature's form. The Shadow Maw exists partially outside our reality, Professor Kilthara explained, his own voice carrying a note of unease. It feeds on the life force of sentient beings, but unlike the Void Stalker, it consumes the very concept of existence itself. Alex studied the creature with the same calm attention he had shown the others. The Shadow Maw was certainly impressive, but it was still bound by certain rules. It had to hunt, which meant it had needs. It had to exist somewhere, which meant it had limitations. Only 12 encounters with Shadow Maws have been recorded, the professor continued. None of the witnesses survived long enough to provide detailed accounts. What we know comes from automated systems and the final transmissions of the victims. The class sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. Here was a creature so dangerous that even learning about it was potentially fatal. Tomorrow, Professor Kalthara announced, we will discuss defensive strategies and the few recorded instances of successful resistance against these creatures. I suggest you all get adequate rest and perhaps seek counseling if needed. As the students filed out, Alex heard the same conversations repeated in dozens of languages. Fear, awe, and a desperate need to understand how to survive in a universe populated by such horrors. But Alex walked out in silence, his mind already working on the problem from a different angle entirely. The third day brought an unexpected change to the routine. As Alex entered the amphitheater, he noticed that several emergency medical stations had been set up around the perimeter. The university's counseling staff moved between the students, offering support to those who had been affected by the previous day's revelations. Alex found his usual seat, noting that the attendance had dropped by nearly half. Those who remained looked haggard, as if they had spent the night fighting off nightmares. Even Krill, the battle-hardened Gromax warrior, seemed subdued. Professor Kilthara entered with a different bearing today. Gone was the academic excitement of the previous lectures, replaced by something that looked almost like regret. His 4 eyes swept over the diminished crowd, and his mandibles clicked in what Alex had learned was a sign of deep thought. Before we continue, the professor began, I want to address the concerns that have been raised by several students and their families. Yes, the universe contains dangerous creatures. Yes, some of them pose a threat to civilized species. But knowledge of these threats is the first step toward defense. A nervous ripple passed through the crowd. Alex noticed that several students had moved closer to the emergency stations, as if proximity to medical help might protect them from the information they were about to receive. Today, we will examine the classification system for Deathworlds, Professor Kilthara announced. Understanding how we categorize these dangerous environments will help you better comprehend the threats we face. The holographic display activated, showing a 3-dimensional model of the galaxy. Various star systems pulsed with different colors, creating a complex pattern of light that was both beautiful and ominous. The Galactic Classification System recognizes 15 levels of Deathworld status, the professor explained. Class 1 represents planets with minor environmental hazards. Class 15 represents worlds so dangerous that even our most advanced military forces avoid them. Alex pulled out his datapad and began taking notes, his simple script flowing across the surface. Around him, other students struggled to keep up with the complex information, their various writing systems creating a cacophony of scratching, clicking, and electronic beeping. The key factors in classification, the professor continued, include atmospheric composition, gravitational extremes, radiation levels, seismic activity, and of course, the presence of dangerous life forms. The display zoomed in on a particular cluster of red-marked systems. These worlds have produced some of the creatures we discussed yesterday. The environmental pressures that created such predators are almost beyond comprehension. A student from the middle section raised what appeared to be a crystalline appendage. "Professor, what about the rumors regarding a world called Earth? I heard it's been classified as a death world." The question caused an immediate stir. Several students turned to look at Alex, who continued taking notes as if nothing had happened. The professor's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of surprise. "Earth," Professor Kalthara said slowly, "is indeed classified as a Class 12. Death world. However, it represents an unusual case in our classification system." The holographic display shifted to show a blue-green planet that looked deceptively peaceful from orbit. Alex recognized the familiar swirl of clouds over the continents he had called home for most of his life. "Unlike the worlds we have previously discussed," the professor continued, "Earth's dangers are primarily environmental rather than predatory. The planet experiences extreme weather patterns, seismic instability, and dangerous radiation exposure." Several students laughed, the sound taking various forms across the different species. The Etherians flickered with amusement, while the Pixarians chittered in their high-pitched voices. The dominant species, humans, have somehow managed to thrive in this environment, the professor added. Though they lack the advanced abilities of most galactic species, they show remarkable adaptability to their hostile world. Alex felt dozens of eyes turn toward him, but he kept his expression neutral. This was exactly the kind of reaction he had expected. "But surely," called out a tall Centaurian from the front row, "if it's a death world, it must have some dangerous creatures?" Professor Kalthara consulted his datapad, scrolling through what appeared to be a lengthy document. "The most significant predators appear to be aquatic creatures called sharks. They possess rows of serrated teeth and can reach considerable size, but they're confined to the planet's oceans." The description caused another wave of amusement. To species that had faced voidstalkers and plasmavorms, the idea of being afraid of a large fish seemed absurd. "There are also various large mammals," the professor continued. "Lions, tigers, bears, and similar creatures. They represent typical predator archetypes, though they can be dangerous to unprotected humans." A Pixarian near the front actually giggled. "They sound almost cute compared to what we've been studying." "The humans themselves," the professor added, "pose no threat to advanced species. They have no natural weapons, no energy projection abilities, and no psychic powers. Their physical structure is actually quite fragile, their bones break easily, and they require constant intake of water and food to survive." The laughter grew louder. Alex heard comments in various languages, most of them expressing amazement that such weak creatures could survive on any kind of death world. "Their only notable characteristic," Professor Kalthara concluded, "is an unusual resistance to their planet's environmental hazards. They can survive in temperature ranges that would kill most species, and they show remarkable recovery from injury." Krill leaned over to whisper to Alex, "No offense, but your species sounds rather pathetic compared to what we've been learning about." "None taken," Alex replied quietly. "We're not very impressive by galactic standards." The professor was now fielding questions from across the amphitheater. Students seemed eager to learn more about this supposedly harmless death world and its primitive inhabitants. "How do humans defend themselves against their planet's dangers?" asked an Altarian. "Primitive tools, mostly," the professor replied. "They've developed various forms of technology, but nothing that would concern an advanced species. Their weapons are chemical-based projectiles and simple energy devices. What about their military capabilities?" pressed a student from the back. "Humans are persistence hunters," the professor explained. They rely on endurance rather than strength or speed. Their military tactics involve wearing down opponents through sustained pressure rather than decisive strikes. Alex found himself suppressing a smile. The professor's description was technically accurate, but it missed several crucial details about human nature and capabilities. The most interesting aspect of human psychology, the professor continued, is their pack bonding behavior. They form extremely strong social connections, even with other species. Many humans have been observed attempting to domesticate or befriend creatures that could easily kill them. This observation caused genuine bewilderment among the students. The idea of trying to befriend a dangerous predator seemed incomprehensible. To most species, are there any humans here at the university? Asked a curious Here and Professor Kilthara gestured toward the back of the amphitheater. We have one human student in our program. Alex Turner has been with us for 3 months, as part of a cultural exchange. All eyes turned to Alex, who raised his hand in a simple greeting. Hello, everyone, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the universal translator. Alex, the professor called out, perhaps you could share some insights about life on Earth? I'm sure your classmates would be interested in hearing about Deathworld survival from a native perspective. Alex stood slowly, considering his words carefully. The amphitheater fell silent, hundreds of alien students waiting to hear from the representative of a supposedly primitive species. Earth is challenging, he said finally. But it's also home. You adapt to what you know, and you learn to work with your environment rather than against it. What about the dangerous creatures? Called out a student from the middle section. How do you deal with sharks and lions? Mostly by avoiding them, Alex replied. But when you can't avoid them, you learn to think like they do. Understanding. A predator's behavior is usually more effective than trying to fight it. The answer seemed to satisfy the students, who nodded in understanding. To them, it sounded like the practical wisdom of a survivor, nothing more. Thank you, Alex, Professor, Kilthara said. Tomorrow we will begin our practical exercises, including virtual reality simulations of encounters with some of the creatures we've studied. As the class filed out, Alex heard the familiar conversations about the day's revelations. But now, there was a new element: curiosity about the harmless human who had somehow managed to survive on a death world. If only they knew what survival on Earth really meant. The fourth day brought an announcement that sent ripples of excitement and terror through the student body. Professor Kilthara stood before the assembled class with a grave expression, his 4 eyes reflecting the amphitheater's lighting in an almost hypnotic pattern. The university has approved a practical exercise, the professor announced, his voice carrying across the reduced crowd. The virtual reality survival challenge will allow volunteer students to apply the theoretical knowledge we have been discussing in a controlled environment. Alex noticed that several students immediately began gathering their belongings, clearly planning to leave before they could be pressured into participating. The Pixarians huddled together, their tiny forms trembling with obvious fear. Participation is voluntary, Professor Kilthara continued, but it will count as 30% of your final grade. Those who choose not to participate will need to complete an alternative research project. The professor gestured toward the side of the amphitheater, where a series of sleek metal pods had been wheeled in during the night. Each pod was roughly the size of a small vehicle, with a transparent canopy and various sensors protruding from its surface. The simulation will place you in a virtual environment where you must survive an encounter with one of the creatures we have studied, the professor explained. You will have access to standard galactic defensive technology and must survive for 1 standard hour. A brave Altarian raised her crystalline hand. What happens if we fail in the simulation? The pods are equipped with full safety protocols, the professor replied. Physical harm is impossible, but the psychological impact is designed to be as realistic as possible. Some students may experience lingering effects from traumatic simulations. Alex watched as roughly half the remaining students quietly slipped out of the amphitheater. Those who stayed looked nervous but determined, many of them probably calculating whether the grade boost was worth the potential psychological trauma. The creature you face will be randomly selected by the computer, Professor Kelthara continued. This ensures fairness and prevents students from preparing for specific encounters. Krill leaned over to Alex. Are you planning to participate? Considering it, Alex replied, his voice calm despite the tension in the air around them. You realize this could be extremely dangerous, the Gromax warrior pressed. These simulations are designed to be as realistic as possible. Even experienced military personnel have been known to suffer lasting effects, Alex nodded thoughtfully. I understand the risks. The professor began calling for volunteers, and slowly, students began making their way down to the simulation pods. Alex watched as the first participant, a confident Centaurian warrior, sealed himself into one of the devices. Through the external monitors, the class could observe the simulation in progress. The warrior found himself in a twisted landscape of purple crystalline formations, facing off against a gravity manipulator. The creature moved like a giant slug, but its ability to manipulate local gravitational fields made it nearly impossible to approach for 20 minutes. The Centaurian used every piece of defensive technology available, creating energy barriers and launching various projectiles. He managed to avoid the creature's attacks through skillful use of his anti-gravity boots, but he was clearly outmatched. The simulation ended with the warrior cowering behind an energy barrier while the gravity manipulator slowly crushed his defenses. He emerged from the pod shaking and pale, his usual confidence completely shattered. Next volunteer, Professor Kelthara called out. One by one, students faced their assigned creatures. The results were consistently terrifying. A Pixarian lasted only minutes against a Void Stalker before the creature's psychological attacks overwhelmed her completely. An Etherian faced a plasma worm and spent the entire hour hiding in a cave, too terrified to even attempt a defense. Alex made his way down to the staging area, adding his name to the volunteer list. Several students tried to talk him out of it. No offense, said a concerned Altarian, but if trained warriors are struggling, what chance does a human have? Maybe none, Alex replied honestly, but I'm curious to see what happens. The professor approached him with obvious concern. Alex, I admire your courage, but perhaps you should reconsider. The psychological impact of these simulations can be severe, and humans may be more vulnerable than other species. I appreciate the concern, Alex said, but I'd like to try. Professor Kelthara consulted his datapad, checking the random assignment. System. His 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of alarm. The system has assigned you a Shadow Maw encounter, he said slowly. This is perhaps the most dangerous simulation we offer. Even our most advanced military training programs rarely use this scenario. A hush fell over the observation area. Students who had been chatting nervously fell silent, turning to stare at the human who had just been handed what amounted to a death sentence. I could override the system, the professor offered, assign you something less challenging. Alex considered this for a moment, then shook his head. I'll take what I got. The professor looked genuinely distressed. Alex, you must understand, no student has ever survived a full hour against a Shadow Maw simulation. The psychological trauma alone, I understand, Alex interrupted gently. But I'd still like to try. With obvious reluctance, Professor Kelthara led Alex to the simulation pod. The device hissed open, revealing a comfortable interior lined with sensors and safety equipment. Remember, the professor said as Alex settled into the pod, this is just a simulation. Nothing can physically harm you. If you need to abort, simply say the word terminate, and the system will immediately shut down. Alex nodded and settled back into the pod's cushioned interior. The canopy sealed with a soft hiss, and he felt the familiar tingling sensation of the neural interface connecting to his brain. The world dissolved around him, replaced by a landscape of twisted shadows and impossible geometry. The air itself seemed to writhe with malevolent energy, and in the distance, something that might have been a mountain moved with predatory intent. Through the external monitors, Alex's classmates watched in fascination and horror as the simulation began. The human sat perfectly still in the nightmarish landscape, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and steady. Why isn't he moving? Whispered a student. Maybe he's frozen with fear, suggested another, but Professor Kilthara was watching the biometric readings with growing amazement. Instead of the expected spike in heart rate and stress hormones, Alex's vital signs were actually becoming more stable. For the first few minutes, Alex remained motionless, apparently meditating in the middle of a horror beyond imagination. The Shadowmaw could be anywhere, everywhere, or nowhere, and the human seemed completely unconcerned. Then Alex opened his eyes and smiled. What happened next would be discussed in xenobiology departments across the galaxy for decades to come. The human didn't run, didn't hide, and didn't even draw the defensive weapons provided by the simulation. Instead, Alex Turner began to hunt. The observation area fell into stunned silence as they watched the human move through the nightmare landscape. With the casual confidence of someone taking a walk through a park, when the Shadowmaw struck from impossible angles, Alex was somehow never quite where it expected him to be, the creature that existed partially outside. Reality found itself facing something it had never encountered before, a consciousness that seemed to exist partially outside sanity, and that made all the difference. Alex moved like water, flowing around attacks that should have been unavoidable. He seemed to understand the creature's nature in a way that transcended the theoretical knowledge his classmates had been studying. "How is this possible?" whispered Professor Kelthara, checking and rechecking the readings. The simulation continued. But instead of the expected horror show, the students found themselves watching something that resembled a deadly dance. The Shadowmaw, accustomed to fear and confusion, seemed almost frustrated by its inability to affect the human. Alex didn't fight the creature directly. Instead, he seemed to be teaching it something about the nature of predation, showing it that fear was a choice rather than an inevitability. As the hour mark approached, something unprecedented happened. The Shadowmaw, the terror of the Veil Nebula, began to retreat from the human who showed no fear. The simulation ended with Alex standing calmly in the center of the nightmare landscape, completely unharmed and apparently unaffected by the encounter. The observation area remained silent as the pod hissed open and Alex emerged, straightening his clothes with the same casual motion he might use after a nap. "Interesting," he said mildly. The silence in the amphitheater stretched for what felt like an eternity. Hundreds of alien students stared at the human who had just accomplished the impossible, their various forms of expressing shock creating a frozen tableau of disbelief. Alex stepped down from the simulation pod and walked calmly back toward his seat, passing students who seemed unable to process what they had witnessed. Professor Kilthara remained frozen at the control console, his 4 eyes fixed on the biometric readings that defied everything he understood about psychology and fear response. "That's impossible," whispered a Centauran from the front row. "No one survives a Shadowmaw encounter." "The simulation must have malfunctioned," added an Etherian, his gaseous form flickering with agitation. "There's no other explanation." Professor Kilthara finally found his voice. "Alex, please remain here. I need to run a full diagnostic on the simulation system." But Alex was already settling into his usual seat, pulling out his datapad as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The professor's mandibles clicked rapidly as he began running diagnostics, his movements sharp with nervous energy. "The system shows no malfunctions," he announced after several minutes of frantic checking. All parameters were within normal ranges. The Shadowmaw simulation ran exactly as designed. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If the simulation had worked correctly, then somehow a human had accomplished what no other species in the galaxy had ever managed. Krill turned to stare at Alex with new eyes. "How did you do that?" "Do what?" Alex asked, genuinely puzzled by the attention. "You defeated a Shadowmaw," the Gromax warrior said slowly. "That's not possible. These creatures are apex predators that exist partially outside reality. They feed on fear and confusion, and you showed neither." Alex considered this for a moment. "I suppose I wasn't afraid because I understood what I was facing." "Understood?" Professor Kelthara's voice carried a note of desperation. "How could you possibly understand something that exists beyond our dimensional framework?" "It's still a predator," Alex replied simply. Predators follow patterns, even when those patterns seem impossible. The shadow maw hunts by creating fear and confusion, then feeding on the resulting psychological collapse. Remove the fear, and it's just another animal trying to survive. The explanation seemed to confuse the students even more. They had spent days learning about creatures that defied comprehension, and now this human was discussing them as if they were ordinary animals. But the psychological impact, pressed the Pixarian. The terror, the existential dread, how did you resist that? Alex shrugged. I grew up on a death world. You learn to deal with scary things. The casual dismissal of what they considered ultimate horror sent another wave of shock through the amphitheater. Students began whispering among themselves, trying to reconcile what they had witnessed with everything they thought they knew about humans and Earth. Professor Kilthara was scrolling through his datapad, pulling up files that had been classified until now. Alex, I need to ask you some questions about your home planet. The official reports may have been incomplete. What would you like to know? Alex asked. These sharks you mentioned, how large do they get? Great whites can reach about 20 feet, Alex replied, but they're not the dangerous ones. The real problem is that they're everywhere in the ocean, and they're perfectly adapted to their environment. 20 feet, the professor repeated, making notes. And the land predators. Tigers can weigh up to 600 pounds. Lions hunt in coordinated packs. Bears are opportunistic omnivores that can run faster than humans despite their size. The students listened in growing alarm as Alex described Earth's fauna in matter-of-fact terms. What had seemed like harmless creatures from the professor's earlier description now sounded considerably more threatening. You mentioned they're not the dangerous ones, Professor Kilthara said carefully. What is dangerous on your world? Alex thought for a moment. Disease, mostly. Viruses that can kill millions. Bacteria that eat flesh. Parasites that take over your brain and change your behavior? Several students made sounds of disgust and alarm. The idea of invisible predators that could rewrite consciousness struck them as more horrifying than the dimensional horrors they had been studying. Then there are the environmental hazards, Alex continued. Earthquakes that can level cities. Volcanic eruptions that change the climate. Hurricanes with winds that can tear apart buildings. But surely your species has developed defenses against these things, a Centauran called out. We adapt, Alex said simply. We build better structures. Develop medicines, create early warning systems. But mostly we just learn to live with the danger. Live with it? The concept seemed to baffle the assembled students. Earth is dangerous, Alex explained. But it's also home. You can't eliminate all the risks, so you learn to manage them. You develop instincts, you stay alert, and you help each other survive. Professor Kilthara was making rapid notes, his academic mind racing to process this new information. Alex, how many humans are there on Earth? About 8 billion. The number hit the amphitheater like a physical blow. 8 billion members of a species that could apparently stare down a shadow maw without flinching. 8 billion, the professor repeated slowly. And they all live on this Class 12 Deathworld? It's the only planet we have, Alex replied. We make do. Make do, whispered a student. They make do with 8 billion apex predators. The realization was spreading through the crowd like wildfire. They had been thinking of humans as primitive and harmless, but the evidence suggested something entirely different. Alex, Professor, Kilthara said carefully, what do humans do for entertainment? Lots of things, Alex replied. Sports, music, art, reading. Some people like extreme sports, jumping out of aircraft, climbing mountains, swimming with sharks. Swimming with sharks, the professor repeated faintly. For fun, Alex added helpfully. The amphitheater was now buzzing with alarmed conversation. Students were sharing data, cross-referencing Alex's casual revelations with their own species' capabilities and limitations. Professor, called out a trembling Etherian, what does this mean for the galactic classification system? Professor. Kilthara looked up from his furious note-taking. It means we may need to completely revise our understanding of Deathworld classifications. and possibly our understanding of what constitutes a dangerous species. But humans seem so harmless, protested a Pixarian. They're friendly, they bond with other species, they don't even have natural weapons. Neither do Shadowmaws, Alex pointed out. They're dangerous because of how they think, not because of what they look like. The comparison sent another chill through the crowd. If humans were psychologically comparable to Shadowmaws, what did that mean for the rest of the galaxy? Alex, Professor Kalthara said slowly, when you encountered the Shadowmaw in the simulation, what were you thinking? Alex considered the question seriously. I was thinking about persistence hunting. My ancestors used to chase prey animals for days across the African savanna. Not because they were faster or stronger, but because they never gave up. They would track an animal until it collapsed from exhaustion. And you applied this to the Shadowmaw? In a way, Alex replied. The creature was trying to exhaust me psychologically instead of physically. But the principle is the same: you outlast your opponent. But you didn't just outlast it, Krill pointed out. You seem to dominate it, Alex shrugged. On Earth, everything is trying to kill you. You learn to project confidence even when you're afraid. Showing fear to a predator is usually the worst thing you can do. The students were now staring at Alex with a mixture of fascination and terror. This human who had seemed so harmless was describing psychological warfare tactics that made their advanced civilizations seem naive. What happens, asked a nervous Altarian, when humans encounter something they can't defeat? We learn from it, Alex replied. We study it, we develop new strategies, we come back better prepared. Humans are very good at solving problems, especially when those problems involve survival. Professor Kilthara was now frantically accessing classified military databases, cross-referencing human capabilities with galactic threat assessments. What he found made his 4 eyes widen in alarm. Students, he announced, his voice carrying a note of urgency. I'm going to need to cut today's class short. I have some urgent communications to make to the Galactic Council. As the students filed out, Alex heard fragments of conversation in dozens of languages. The tone had changed completely from the casual dismissal of humans they had shown earlier. 8 billion of them, someone whispered. And they think swimming with sharks is fun, replied another voice. What else are they not telling us about? Earth? Alex gathered his belongings and prepared to leave, but Professor Kilthara called out to him. Alex, I need to ask you one more question. Are all humans like you? Alex thought about his family back on Earth, his friends, his neighbors. Ordinary people living ordinary lives in an environment that would terrify most of the galaxy. Pretty much, he replied. I'm not particularly special. Professor Kilthara made one final note on his datapad, then looked up at the human student, who had just turned his understanding of the universe upside down. I think, he said slowly, that we may need to reclassify Earth. What category would you put it in? Alex asked curiously. The professor's mandibles clicked rapidly as he considered the question. I'm not sure we have a category for a world. That produces 8 billion apex predators who consider interdimensional horrors to be an interesting academic exercise. Alex smiled. We just call it home. As he walked out of the amphitheater, Alex reflected on the day's events. His classmates were probably going to treat him differently now, and he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Behind him, Professor Kilthara was already composing an urgent message to the Galactic Council, recommending that Earth's classification be upgraded from Class 12 Deathworld to something requiring an entirely new category. The message would eventually result in the establishment of the Turner Protocol, a set of guidelines for interacting with species that had evolved on worlds where survival required the psychological traits of an apex predator. But for now, Alex Turner just walked back to his dormitory, looking forward to calling his family and telling them about his interesting day at school.